The theme for the Mahindra Sanatkada Lucknow Festival this year, which is 2018, is Francisi Awadhi Ta'alluqaat, which very roughly translates to the French connection with Lucknow. I think over the course of this festival and in choosing this theme, we are trying to explore this concept of exchange. So the French, in their relatively short stint in Awadh, contributed greatly to, in a way, the development of arts, trade, architecture, also literature in many ways. Not to say that all this was already not available here. It was all available, except the French just about added to what was in a way pre-existing. So in the field of arts, the French mercenaries, essentially, people who came either as a part of the French company or as a part of the English company, came and settled in Awadh, because obviously at this point in time the Awadh kingdom was a relatively new empire, and they were welcomed to the courts of Faizabad as well as Lucknow by the Nawabs at this point. In Faizabad, Shujauddaulah, followed by Asifuddaulah in Lucknow. And here they provided patronage to, in some ways, a lot of local artists to develop very interesting forms of or techniques in art that kind of changed the way in which art was now perceived and conceived in Awadh. To give you a very brief insight into how exactly this happened, Jean-Baptiste Gentil came to, as a part of the French company, came to the court of Faizabad, and here he was officially in the official capacity of training about 400 to 600 troops that belonged to the army of Shujauddaulah. And along with this military training and also acting as an agent or mediator for Shujauddaulah in his exchanges with the British and other Mughal princes, he also initiated several local artists like Nevasi Lal and Mohan Singh into what came to be known as Firangi paintings, or which Firangi paintings very broadly refer to one of the first kinds of European influences in local art in Awadh, and this gave way to the company style of art eventually. So coming back to Jean-Baptiste Gentil, so what he did is he compiled an album which comprised several folios, and each of these folios was dedicated to some aspect of ideas, practices, life, etc. that he noted in his time spent in Awadh. So some of the themes he covered were those of local gods and goddesses. He commissioned these local artists to make impressions of local gods and goddesses, of festivals that were celebrated in Awadh. So he has done extensive paintings of Muharram, Diwali, Holi, Dashera, etc. He also tried to paint everyday life. A particularly interesting painting in this regard has been the jewelry worn by local women in Awadh. He painted the arms and ammunition that was being used by the army of Shujauddaulah. The end purpose of compiling this album was that when he was finally ousted from the court of the Nawab, he presented all these albums to the French king, the Cabinet des Roues, as it is called, the Royal Museum in Paris. And in some ways he was just, through this process of documenting and presenting it to France, trying to acquaint the ruler in France with what exactly happened in India, or what made up India. As far as Jean-Baptiste Gentil is concerned, there were several other artists or several other Frenchmen who were commissioning art, including Antoine Apollier, Benoît de Boyne, Claude Martin, Charles Marsac, etc. And in their individual capacities, they all contributed to art. I think the most noted name as far as architecture is concerned is Claude Martin, French influence when we talk about in particular. Now, Claude Martin was obviously a very well-known figure and probably also the most widely documented. He started his career in Pondicherry as a member of the French company, as rather a soldier in the French company, and later, when it was more profitable to be a part of the English East India Company, he switched loyalties and he was employed by the East India Company as well as the Nawab of Awadh, and he headed the arsenal in Lucknow. The Nawab of Awadh at this point is, of course, Asif-ud-Daula. And during his stay in Awadh, he commissioned paintings, he designed and built several homes. He was also a very established trader. His estate was at Najafgarh, and he was known to have brought very interesting techniques, European techniques of plantation, etc., to Najafgarh. Townhouses is Farad Bakhsh, which stands on the banks of the Gomti and is presently under a lot of restoration work. There are several European imprints, that distinctly European imprints, that came to be incorporated in any kind of architectural activity that was undertaken in Lucknow, and in many ways Claude Martin was largely responsible for that. One of the first buildings he constructed was Farhad Bakhsh, which was his townhouse. Later he sold Farhad Bakhsh to Asif-ud-Daula, and he embarked upon a project to construct a country house for himself, which today is known as Constantia or Lamartine College. When we look at Lamartine, there is no element that you can trace back to having French origins in particular, but there are several European influences that can be found in Constantia. For example, there are a lot of, there's the extensive use of Greek columns, there is extensive use of statues, there are also very interesting pediments. What is a very distinct Claude Martin introduction into the cityscape as far as architecture is concerned is the crown-like structure that we find on top of Constantia. Now, just to put this into perspective, Constantia was completed in about 1801, soon after Claude Martin died, and about 50 years later, in 1848, when the Kaisarbagh Palace complex was constructed, the then Nawab, Wajid Ali Shah, used exactly the same kind of architectural techniques while commissioning the Lucky Gates. And this particular technique was a breakaway from the traditional Mughal style of embellishing any gateway or any structure with domes. And the crown that one finds in Constantia is also is in many ways an inspiration to the crown that one finds on both the Lucky Gates in the Kaisarbagh Palace complex. Another very interesting and not so well known structure that Claude Martin constructed in Lucknow was his cockpit, where cockfights would take place. Today it exists as Kakori Koti. Once again, there is nothing French nothing outwardly French, but as this cockpit too is characterized by these huge Grecian pillars, but one does find very interesting techniques of the use of the pediment, which is a triangular structure on top of either gateways or windows or whatever, quite extensively used in this particular structure. Another technique which is used extensively by Claude Martin and traces its origins back to France is the trompe d'oeil, which roughly translates to a deception to the eye. This particular technique is essentially used to introduce some kind of symmetry into a building, and to give you a very rough or a very vague example would be that if a door was constructed and there was no space for or no possibility of the incorporation of another door right in a symmetrical order to this one particular door, door was made of cement, just so that there was a symmetry introduced into the structure. We find this extensively, this particular technique has been used extensively in several homes as well as other significant architectural structures in Lucknow. And this kind of technique was used not just for doors but also for windows, also for skylights and fireplaces in some cases as well. So yes, that's as far as his architecture is concerned.